This program and its contents are designed for information and educational purposes only. This program does not render medical advice or professional services and is not intended to be a substitute for professional care. The information provided here should not be used for the purposes of diagnosing or treating a medical or psychiatric condition. If you have or suspect you may have a health problem, consult your healthcare provider.
Positive Momentum TV is brought to you by Movement Solutions.
A DBT therapist, and we've been discussing invalidating environments. And Katie, can you kind of recap invalidating environments?
So an invalidating environment is one in which your personal experiences are not validated by the environment around you. And so examples of that, especially with children, are simple things like, I'll give you something to cry about. Or, this hurts me more than it hurts you. Some of the things we've heard growing up. The idea that whatever children are feeling is sometimes overridden by the parents around them. And when that happens, children don't learn how to regulate their emotion. Okay. So it contributes to emotion regulation problems. There's biological things that contribute to problems with emotion regulation. You can be born genetically more emotional than other people. There's impulse control stuff that goes with that can be genetic. So there's biological things, then there's environmental things that contribute to emotion regulation. If you live in a home where there's yelling and screaming and violence and chaos, then there's oftentimes an underlying anxiety and fear that exists for a child. If that doesn't get validated for a child, then they just shove it down under, and what then eventually develops is emotion regulation problems because they don't learn to deal with that anxiety in a way that works. So when emotions aren't validated, children don't learn how to validate their own emotions and regulate emotion. You miss the skill of emotion regulation because children in those environments will shove their feelings down, push them away, try not to feel them, and then eventually, of course, what we know about emotions is they are energy, and they eventually come out one way or another. They'll come out sideways in negative thoughts, and words we say to people. They'll come out in our judgments. They'll come out in the way we interact with others. We may have temper tantrums. We may get depression. We may get sick, physically ill, because the immune system is right next to the emotion regulation part of the brain where emotions are born. And so all of that affects the whole body when we don't get that validation and when we don't learn how to regulate our emotions.
And so if this happens as children and we still don't learn how to regulate our emotions or how to find good release or get the proper assistance to develop into, I don't know, I don't want to tag anybody, but anyway, if we don't get the right skills, we become adults with no emotion regulation, and then we rinse and repeat, and that's how we have, even though those of us, I can say, okay, I would never do that to my kids, and what do? You grow up and you, when did I turn into my parent?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that it's something you wanted to do, because who wants to put somebody through the same pain you've been through? Mm-hmm. But you don't realize this is what you've learned, this is the only thing you know.
Yes, if you've not been validated in the pain or anxiety or feelings you had growing up, then how are you going to validate that in someone else? Right. And so there is a generational effect to this. And most of this, a lot of this can be attributed to trauma. And many times we don't really recognize the effects of trauma in children. And one of the primary effects of trauma is anxiety and avoidance of all the cues that remind you of the things that frightened you. And so it's so insidious in the way that emotion regulation affects every area of your life. So we know that if you don't get validation, you don't learn to regulate emotion. If you don't learn to regulate emotion, what happens to your relationships? Then they become chaotic and difficult. We don't know, who do we love? Do I really love them? Should I love them? We don't know how we feel about things. We end up fighting with people over undercurrents that we're not even sure we know what they are. And so then we have interpersonal problems. Then if you've got emotion regulation problems going on and you've got relationship problems going on, you're going to end up wanting to fix it somehow because it's uncomfortable when things aren't working right. Self-esteem is affected when we aren't getting along with the people we love. So then what happens is impulse control problems. We develop, I call it drinking, drugs, and rock and roll. We look for feeling better outside of ourselves. Anything to make me feel better. Then we develop problems with shopping and eating and drugs and alcohol and sex and porn and all the different things that we use to self-soothe when we don't know how to regulate our emotions. So basically, compulsions are born that way. Also, if you look at the continuum, and we don't learn how to regulate guilt and shame, for instance.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Guilt, I think of sociopathy and antisocial personality disorder as really a disorder that is directly related to a person's ability to regulate guilt and shame. If children are overly shamed or held accountable, they don't learn to regulate shame, and then there's almost an allergy to those feelings.
I can see where just being, depending on the environment, period, there's an allergy to feeling. That's a great way to put that, you know.
So on the continuum, it has huge impact for society. My original interest was world peace. That's what I wanted to be when I grew up, and for many, many years people said, you should be a therapist, you should be a therapist. And when I was in high school, everybody came to me when they thought they were pregnant and that kind of stuff, and I was like, I don't want to be a therapist. Because to me, it wasn't scientific enough. It didn't have enough validity. I felt like it was sort of a fake science, so I didn't want to do it. What I was interested in after watching all the news shows with Walter Cronkite talking about the Vietnam War is I wanted to do something about the crazy thing we do with war and killing each other, which for emotional reasons and reasons we don't even know. And but I couldn't find where you apply for that job for world peace. I was like, I don't know what line I get into for that job. And so I didn't want to be a therapist. All I knew is I was interested in this. But when I learned DBT, I saw in DBT something that I thought could have an impact on world peace. Kind of one person at a time, teaching people how to regulate their emotion and teaching them emotional intelligence certainly couldn't hurt the peace process.
So that's where Peace Army comes from.
That's where the name of my practice comes from.
That's a
Positive Momentum TV is brought to you by Movement Solutions.